From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the situation in Northeastern Syria. Following a telephone call with Turkish President Erdogan, President Trump, late Sunday night, announced that the U.S. troops in the Northeast would be withdrawing from the border with Turkey, a move Turkey seems to have taken as a green light for military action. Ankara has long voiced concerns over Washington's cooperation in the fight against ISIS with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and specifically the Syrian Kurdish group known as the People's Protection Units, or YPG, which it views as an offshoot of the Kurdistan Workers' Party and a terrorist group. On Wednesday, Turkey launched a military operation, known as Operation Peace Spring, targeting the Northeast, and released a statement saying it aimed to, quote, prevent the creation of a terror corridor, end quote, across its southern border. To discuss the situation, I'm joined today by two excellent guests, Ambassador Robert Pearson and Elizabeth Dent. Bob is a non-resident scholar here at MEI, a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and a former Director General of the U.S. Foreign Service. Liz is a non-resident scholar here at MEI as well, and previously worked in various capacities at the State Department for the U.S. Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS from 2014 to 2019. Bob, Liz, welcome to the podcast, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Liz, let's start with you. What do we know so far about the Turkish military operation launched on Wednesday, and what, in your view, is likely to be the impact?
It's a good question. So today, obviously, with Operation Peace Spring occurring, we do know that the Turks say that they want to clear off their southern border. So far, we've seen shelling with warplanes and artillery, mostly in three locations, Kamishli, Tel Abyad, and Kobani. We've seen some reporting of airstrikes about 30 kilometers into Syria around Ain Issa, but we haven't been able to actually confirm that that's occurring. U.S. officials have stated that all of the Defeat ISIS operations have been suspended with the SDF as they scramble to protect themselves and their people from these attacks. And we're already seeing ISIS take advantage of that. Monday night, there were a series of attacks in Raqqa. So I think the question right now is how far will this incursion go into Syria?
Bob, this is the third Turkish incursion into northern Syria since 2016. How do you see it playing out, and is this time likely to prove any different from the previous two?
I think that, of course, there has to be some foreign policy objective here, but basically this is being driven by domestic concerns. In the June election, which Mr. Erdogan lost, in Istanbul, his candidate lost as mayor, the government really pulled out all the stops. They poured money into loyalist groups. They played on religion. They demonized minorities. They did every single thing that a populist leader could do to try to win that election, and they failed by a substantial margin. And since that time, they have tried to market some ideas that appear to be responses to the concerns then, the purges and their consequences on the population, the impact of the refugees in the Turkish economy and society, and of course, a weakening economy. But these measures really don't appear to have a great deal of substance in them. One is aimed at freedom of the press, so-called. The other one is another one is for judicial reform. And I think that one of the main reasons behind this incursion is the knowledge that Turks will respond to the use of their military force abroad, and he will consolidate. Mr. Erdogan can consolidate his domestic base, waiting for some attempt to weaken the opposition politically. So I think that, in answer to your last thought, none of the previous incursions have been successful. Each of them has resulted in Turkey being forced to back from the geography it seized and been forced to agree to Russian demands that they leave the territory and be on the verge of leaving the territory. And I see in the Russian statements about their expression of concern towards Turkey and the Syrian statements about withdrawal, basically the same scenario being played again this time.
Liz, where does this leave the SDF? General Muslim, the commander of the SDF, said on Tuesday that they're considering a partnership with Assad with the aim of fighting Turkish forces. Does this mean that a deal with the regime is in the cards? And if so, what sort of deal would that look like?
I don't actually think we know where this leaves the SDF. And I think a lot of that is because the U.S. doesn't totally understand what the policy it's articulating is. As far as a deal with the regime, I think 18 months ago, the regime would have been very open to negotiating with the SDF for some sort of reconciliation, especially if a U.S. withdrawal was in the works, and some elements of the regime would have been invited to return to the Northeast, like we're seeing with the Tabqa Dam, and also particularly for some of the resources. But I really just don't think that that flexibility is there anymore. It's likely that the Russians in the regime now want to punish the SDF for its partnership with the U.S. and may well allow this attack to go on for some time before offering a path out, similar to what they did in Afrin, where the Russians packed up and left. Of course, it's not in the regime's interest to cede any of the Syrian territory to Turkey, but it is in their interest to ensure that the SDF negotiates with them from the weakest position possible. It is possible that the SDF could send some sort of signal now that they would be willing to fold on a number of issues, but we just don't know what those discussions look like right now.
Following up from that, where does this leave the U.S.? Does this mean that a U.S. withdrawal is kind of inevitable at this point, or it just seems pretty murky as well?
I think it's really hard to walk back what happened on Sunday night with that White House statement. We've been through this now 3 times. I know the president and his advisors and the Pentagon and State Department have attempted to try to walk it back, but it seems to have just muddied the waters further. So we're not really sure what it means for the U.S. either. We certainly know that they've removed troops from along the border, but we also know that troops are still stationed 30 kilometers down and then down into the Middle Euphrates River Valley and in other areas that we did liberate with the SDF. So it's a bit difficult to figure out if the plan is to fully withdraw from the rest of those areas and by when. But I do think that the president has been very clear over the last 2.5 years that he wants out of Syria. So I would say that whether it's now or in however long, I think that a withdrawal is inevitable.
How do you see this affecting the other actors in the conflict? You mentioned the Assad regime. You mentioned Russia before. Do you want to elaborate that? And maybe what about Iran? Where does this have any impact on Iran?
Well, all 3 of those actors view a U.S. presence in Syria as illegal and have wanted us out since we've arrived. So, of course, they're going to be happy if this sort of entanglement leads to a U.S. departure. We've seen Russia and Turkey and Iran cut deals in other parts of Syria. And now I think we've seen some evidence that Turkey and Russia are coordinating now for maximum pressure on the SDF in order to get that deal with the regime. Like I said earlier, the regime and the Russians, they're very interested in reunifying Syrian territory. And at this point, the only thing that I see that is reasonable for the regime and the Russians and Iran to be greenlighting this Turkish attack is so that they can pressure the SDF into that unconditional surrender.
Bob, what's your sense of Turkey's ultimate objective here? Is this about safeguarding the border or creating this buffer zone, or is it something kind of broader, like undermining or eliminating the autonomous YPG-run entity that's on the border with Turkey?
I think that they have as a kind of dream result some agreement from Russia and perhaps with grudging acceptance by Syria of a Turkish right to have predominant security just on its border and south of its border. I don't think really they can achieve that. I think they've tried that before, and I don't think it will work. But in their dreams, that's what they would like. And I don't think that they really know what they're going to do with this operation yet. Massive artillery, airstrikes will give them a kind of siege capability. They can move forward slowly, confident that they can outshoot any opponent. One eye on the Russians, one eye on Damascus, one eye on the SDF. And I would say very careful not to suffer a defeat. So at least in the early stages, I think that would characterize the way they operate. And then depending on what the results are on the ground, perhaps more. They may see a resurgence of ISIS in such a way as to call into question their initial aims, and they may be forced to react to that. And so I think it's just a little bit early to tell exactly what they have in mind, but I suggest caution is probably the right approach for the first few days.
Following up, what does Turkey's military incursion mean for the US Turkish relationship? What's the response been like in Washington so far? I know I've seen some fairly strong statements, threats of sanctions from people like Lindsey Graham, but do you have a sense of what the kind of immediate impact might be and maybe the longer term impact as well?
Well, I agree with Liz. I think Sunday night and then Wednesday morning really put an end to any really serious Senate attempt to roll back the decision. So you'll remember when the Senate tried to affect the U.S. policy towards Yemen, that proved to be unsuccessful. And so I think that Trump now will be able to weather any backlash from the Senate, but it will leave in the Congress a genuine level of bitterness about abandonment of the Kurds and about the nature of the Turkish regime. So that may come to bear most directly on the F-35 fighter and any attempts to free it so that it could be delivered to the Turks, something that Trump has continued to mention in some of his statements. So I think that we actually haven't improved the Turkish-American relationship much at all. And one final point, the U.S. invited Mr. Erdogan to Washington in 2013, literally rolled out the red carpet. I've never seen a red carpet in the State Department before, but there was one that day for him. Gezi Park demonstrations were in full bloom at that point, and he cracked down without a single indication that he had listened to any American advice he had received. So I don't think trying to seduce him the way Mr. Trump has tried to seduce Kim Jong-un will be successful at all. So I think we're still facing a serious dilemma in our relationship.
And indeed, there's just been another invite for November, right?
November 13. So Mr. Erdogan will receive all the honors. What else he does, where he speaks, who invites him, what else he says. You remember in 2013, his guards got into a fight on public property in front of the Turkish ambassador's residence. So there will be more to this visit than just the call at the White House, and it will be interesting.
Liz, pivoting back to the situation in Syria, where does this leave the ongoing campaign against ISIS?
So, like I mentioned, there have been reports that officials have decided to suspend the campaign, and that's largely because the SDF has had to turn their attention upwards to their northern border, so they're unable to focus on those counter-ISIS operations. If this is a limited incursion, it's possible that over the coming weeks things could calm down and the counter-ISIS operations can resume. But if it's more than just a limited campaign, it's very likely that operations will stay suspended indefinitely.
What, in your view, then, is likely to happen to the tens of thousands of ISIS detainees and families that are currently in detention in the hands of the SDF?
Well, so it's interesting because, of course, as you all have seen, President Trump and Turkey have both mentioned that the Turks plan to take over the detention facilities and the encampments, and we're really not sure what that means. One, because the SDF actually manages the camps and the detention facilities. The U.S. does not. And so I'm not sure how exactly that transition would occur, if it would even occur. But I agree with Ambassador Pearson that I think that Turkey may have bitten off more than they can chew with this ISIS problem. And I think that that will be something that causes their campaign to significantly shift depending on how far in they have to go. But that's the other point, is that the camps are quite far into Syria. So in order for the Turks to actually come in and take over them, they'd have to go 30 to 50 kilometers into northeastern Syria. And I'm just not sure how possible that is. What we do know is that if the Turkish attack is more than just a limited campaign, the SDF will start to remove some of their personnel from the prisons and maintaining security at the camps to protect that forward line to the north with the Turks. So that leaves a lot of ISIS fighters and many of the people in detention who have ISIS sympathies vulnerable to those breakout attacks, which obviously is incredibly concerning given that proclaimed ISIS caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi just released a sermon a couple of weeks ago calling for supporters to carry out prison breaks.
I absolutely agree. 70,000 sympathizers or fighters still left. Liz is exactly right. They're far south of the border. Difficult to see how the Turks, who don't normally have a kind of an expeditionary force capability, are going to be able to go down there and take over. So I think that at this point, neither the U.S. nor Turkey is telling the truth about ISIS and the threat that it represents.
Indeed. I noted that in an op-ed in the Washington Post on Tuesday of this week, Erdogan's communications director specifically said that they would be picking up where the U.S. left off in the fight against ISIS. But given their track record on that, that doesn't necessarily seem like a realistic way forward.
No, it isn't. I completely agree. It is not. And so this will loom larger and larger, as Liz says, as the campaign goes forward, and the people will, the focus will become what is happening to ISIS. And there will be a number of stories that are not going to be good to hear.
The other part of this equation is, of course, the whole issue of Turkey's refugee resettlement plan. Turkey's currently home to around 3.5 million Syrian refugees. Bob, do you have a sense of what Turkey has in mind, how this would work, and what the response has been like to this from the U.S.?
No, I can't say precisely, except that the U.S. agreed in the beginning in August that it would help Turkey make space for these refugees. But of course, in a war, we're actually generating refugees right now and not creating space for refugees. And many of these refugees who fled to Turkey did not live in that border area that Turkey wants them to return to. So that's another major problem. And then, of course, there is the expense. Billions of dollars will be required to set up camps and furnish and protect these people in Syria. And Turkey doesn't have those resources. So it would have to rely on international resources to help pay for the camps and other settlement areas that it's created in Syria. So I think here again is another really open question, and the objective may serve domestic interests for Erdogan for the time being, but the long-term outcome of this plan looks risky.
Yeah, I think Ambassador Pearson is spot on. Listen, it's against UN law to forcibly resettle refugees, not to mention the fact that the Turks want to create the buffer zone along their border and fill it with Arabs that they think will not be a threat to them. And that is a form of ethnic cleansing. So this plan is incredibly problematic and something that I'm really hoping does not come to fruition.
We're running short on time here, but before we wrap up, I'm curious to get both of your thoughts on where things will go from here. Bob, maybe starting with you.
Well, I think looking at the larger picture, American credibility in the region is now in shatters, and no one knows what to believe and what not to believe. And I extend that to any campaign with respect to Iran. The Gulf states are already shaky. And so it does open the door for greater Russian influence in the region. It's almost a gift to Russia for us to indicate that we will withdraw. And I agree with Liz. Inevitably, we're going to have to pull out if the present process is being used. So I worry enormously about the strategic failure that this decision on Sunday night seems to portend.
Liz, you have the last word here. What are your thoughts?
I'd absolutely agree that the strategic ramifications here are massive. I'd also say at a much lower level, this instability that the Turks are now creating with an incursion is in an already very untenuous environment. It could have catastrophic implications, both for our partner force, the SDF, who believes that they will be massacred, as well as, potentially leading to an ISIS resurgence. And if ISIS does resurge in Syria and we need a partner to fight again, well, I'm not sure that we're going to have one.
On that sobering note, I'm afraid we'll have to leave things there. Bob, Liz, thank you both for joining the program today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.